What if I told you that the most terrifying place you could ever work was a church? A church that only opens after midnight, with rules so bizarre that breaking even one could cost you your life. I thought I was desperate when I took the night security job at St. Francis of the Hollow, but I had no idea what I was walking into. The pay was good, too good, and I couldn't refuse it. But those rules, the ones Reverend Blackwood handed me in a sealed envelope, they weren't just guidelines, they were survival instructions. Never respond if someone calls your name. Do not look back when you leave. If the tile in the center of the room changes color, you must form a salt circle and wait for permission to leave. It all sounded insane until I saw for myself. By the time I understood the truth, it was too late. The church wasn't just a building, it was a gateway. And the things that waited behind its doors were far worse than anything I could have imagined. But if you think you're ready to hear the truth, keep listening, because the nightmare is just beginning. Don't forget to subscribe to support the channel and get more spine-chilling stories that will leave you questioning what's real and what's not. Your support helps us create even more terrifying content, and trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming next. I was desperate, and when you're desperate, you'll take anything, even if it means walking into a place that promises nothing but terror. At 28 years old, I had nowhere to go but down. I had been out of work for 6 months, my military discharge hanging over me like a shadow. I tried to find something, anything, that could pay the bills, but nothing ever worked out. It seemed like the universe itself was conspiring against me. I had lived with my sister, Olivia, since I'd been discharged. She was all I had left. Mom died when I was young, and Dad, well, he was a ghost, someone who stopped being around long before he ever physically left. Olivia was the only person I had left, but she was sick. She had been for months. The doctors couldn't figure out what was wrong, but they said it was some sort of autoimmune disorder. Whatever it was draining her. The medications barely helped, and her energy was getting lower every day. She had a nursing job at the local county hospital, but even with that, her paycheck barely covered her bills, let alone mine. I couldn't keep living like this. I was searching for work one night when I came across a listing that made my stomach flip. It was a night security guard position at St. Francis of the Hollow, a church that sat at the edge of town, at the foot of the hills that overlooked the city. The listing caught my attention because it didn't offer much detail about the job. The pay was higher than most security jobs, twice as much in fact. And the hours, midnight to 6 a.m. Not the most conventional shift, but beggars can't be choosers, right? The catch? Well, the church only opened after midnight. That was strange in itself, but the ad promised more details if I was selected for an interview. It seemed cryptic, and I was skeptical but desperate, so I applied. I didn't think much about it at first. The job seemed like any other. At least it was something. I needed the money. Olivia's treatments were only getting more expensive, and we were barely scraping by. The interview. A week later, I received a call to set up an interview. I went in the next morning, walking into the church's small office. The first thing I noticed was how quiet everything was. The church itself was surprisingly grand, with stained glass windows that depicted saints I couldn't recognize. There was an eerie stillness about the place that immediately put me on edge. But I didn't have time for second thoughts. I was here for a job. The man who met me was Reverend Jameson Blackwood. Tall, thin, his face lined with the kind of years that gave him an almost timeless look. His eyes were piercing, dark 2KN. Without thinking, I pulled the small cloth bag of salt from my pocket, hands trembling as I poured the contents in a perfect circle around my platform. My heart pounded in my chest, but I didn't dare break the circle. If I moved even an inch, I knew something would happen. The congregation didn't seem to notice the change. They were still chanting, eyes closed in reverence, completely unaware of the danger that was growing before us. Their voices rose in volume, becoming more frenzied, more desperate. I could hear it then, footsteps from behind me. I froze. I knew what it was. I could feel its presence, a pressure in the air, a weight that seemed to press down on my shoulders. I didn't dare turn around, but I could sense it in the corner of my eye. Something was moving in the shadows, something tall and dark, something that wasn't human. The sound of its footsteps grew louder, and I felt it. It was coming toward me. I squeezed my eyes shut, clutching the salt bag tighter in my hand, the grains slipping between my fingers. My breath was coming in shallow gasps as the temperature dropped, a cold so biting it felt like it was coming from the very earth beneath me. The whispers I had heard earlier seemed to return, echoing in my mind, growing louder. They were calling my name, Tyler. I felt a hand on my shoulder and I snapped around, heart racing. But there was no one there, no one in the shadows. The church was empty. Only the 24 congregants remained, chanting, their faces still serene and oblivious to the darkness unfolding around them. The visitor appears. And then, through the haze of panic, a figure stepped into the church. The doors had opened without a sound, though I didn't hear anyone enter. I didn't even see anyone at first. It was as if the air itself had parted to reveal a shadowy form that didn't belong. It was tall, too tall, its head brushing against the ceiling like it didn't quite fit. The figure was dressed in a dark suit that gleamed faintly under the dim candlelight, and its face was wrong. Too smooth, too neutral. Its features weren't quite human, but they weren't alien either. The best I could describe it was forgettable. There was nothing about it that stood out, nothing about its appearance that you would remember after it left. Its eyes, however, were something else. Its eyes were like black holes, swallowing the light, empty and endless. And when they locked onto me, I felt as though I were being pulled in, as though my very soul was being sucked into that darkness. I didn't move. I couldn't move. The figure took slow, measured steps toward the altar. The floor didn't creak beneath its feet, and there was no sound to its movement. It was as if it was a part of the air itself. Reverend Blackwood stepped forward, his voice calm. "We welcome you," he intoned in a soft, reverent tone. The figure didn't speak. It simply stood in the center of the room, facing the congregation. I didn't know why, but I felt my hands shaking uncontrollably. The air in the church was thick, suffocating, and the cold seemed to press in from all directions. I could hear the whispers again, louder this time, swirling around me like 1,000 voices. "Tyler." Then the figure turned its gaze toward me. I could feel the weight of its eyes pressing into me, like I was being pulled deeper and deeper into the abyss. My breath caught in my throat, and I knew that if I moved, if I so much as blinked, I would fall under its power. And I understood in that instant what this was. It wasn't just a visitor. It wasn't a person. It was something older, something far older than I could ever comprehend. And it was waiting for me to make the wrong move. The unsettling atmosphere grows as Ethan starts to witness more disturbing events during his shift at the church. The rules become increasingly difficult to follow, and the presence of something far darker than he imagined begins to sink in. The visitor's entrance raises the stakes. It had been a week since the incident in the church. A week since the visitor had come, since the unexplainable things had happened. I kept replaying that moment in my head, the terrible moment when the figure had stepped into the church and looked at me. The visitor with its otherworldly eyes had offered me a choice, to pay my debt or face the consequences. I didn't know what was worse, the idea of giving up more of myself or the thought of running. Neither seemed like an option anymore. By the time I got back to my apartment, my mind was a mess. I could still hear the whispers, the chants echoing through the corners of my thoughts, and the unsettling sensation that I was being followed. But the worst part was that I had no escape from it. There was no corner of the world where I could hide. Every day that I went into the church felt like stepping deeper into an abyss, where the rules became more suffocating and the weight of the ritual pulled harder. The first thing I did when I arrived home was check on Olivia. She was asleep, thankfully, but she had been getting worse, sick again, unable to eat, unable to sleep. I had noticed her eyes were sunken, her body frail. The medication was doing nothing anymore. She had begun coughing up blood, and I didn't know what to do. But I did know one thing for sure. The church had something to do with it. I couldn't prove it. I couldn't even begin to explain how or why, but I knew. The visitor had warned me, but I hadn't understood at the time. Now the truth seemed inescapable. The church, the rituals, the debt, it was all tied together. And somehow I was at the center of it all, a change in the rules. That night I prepared myself as usual for my shift. It was another midnight arrival, another midnight job. The rules had become a rote part of my existence, etched into my mind like a mantra. Arrive at exactly midnight. Never before, never after. Wear the badge at all times, symbols facing outward. Never touch it with bare hands. Do not respond to anyone except Reverend Blackwood. If the central tile changes color, use the salt to form a circle and stay within it until Reverend Blackwood gives permission. Leave before dawn. Never look back. But this time, something felt different. Reverend Blackwood had told me that the rules were inflexible, unchangeable. But after what had happened last time, after the visitor had spoken directly to me, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something else going on, something far darker than I had anticipated. As I crossed the street to the church, I felt a presence in the air. It wasn't the usual sense of foreboding or unease. It was like the air was heavy, suffocating in a way that felt personal, like it was watching me. I paused for a moment, my breath catching in my throat, before I turned the doorknob and stepped inside. The doors creaked open, and I immediately noticed the difference. The church felt colder than usual. It wasn't the chill of the night air. It was the kind of cold that settles deep inside your bones, a cold that feels like something's wrong. My heart skipped a beat as I stepped inside. The usual comforting scent of incense was absent, replaced by an almost metallic, sour smell. It was like rust, like something old and decaying. The flickering candles in the corners cast long, crooked shadows on the walls, and the air was thick with a pressure I couldn't explain. Reverend Blackwood wasn't standing at the door to greet me like he usually did. The church was silent, too silent. I called out softly, my voice breaking the stillness. "Reverend?" No answer. I moved deeper into the church, my footsteps echoing unnervingly loud in the silence. The central tile, the one that had glowed on the previous nights, was in place, but tonight it looked different. The color was wrong. It wasn't the pale, muted shade I had grown used to. Now it was a sickly, pulsing green. I froze. This wasn't part of the plan. The unseen visite. The visitor tilted its head, its movements disjointed, like a marionette being controlled by invisible strings. The shadows around it seemed to twist with a life of their own, stretching and contorting in the air. Its eyes never left mine. "No, Tyler Reed," the voice boomed, its tone dripping with malice. "You have always been a part of it. The moment you stepped into this church, the debt was sealed. You are a vessel now, and all vessels must eventually be claimed." The air around me crackled with power, a force I couldn't explain. The rules, the rituals, the price of my own existence, all of it came crashing down on me in that instant. I understood the truth now. The church, the visitor, the rules, they were all part of a cycle, a never-ending cycle of darkness, a force that had been feeding on people like me for centuries. I had never been in control. I had always been just another pawn. But I wasn't ready to accept that. The breaking point. The church began to tremble again. The ground beneath my feet vibrated, a low rumble that grew louder with each passing second. The visitor, now towering over me, raised its hand, its claw-like fingers curling in a way that made my stomach turn. The shadows around it thickened, and I could feel something coming, something far worse than anything I had faced before. The debt must be paid, it hissed, its voice vibrating through my bones. The price will be yours. But before it could strike, I heard something. A loud crack, like thunder. The church walls seemed to shudder in response. Suddenly, the door to the church burst open. It wasn't just a gust of wind. It was as if the very air had been torn apart, a violent force that ripped through the church, sending the candles spiraling into the air. The congregation was thrown back by the force of the blast, their screams filling the church, but it wasn't them I was focused on. It was her, Vivian's arrival. A figure stepped into the church, her silhouette cutting through the blackness like a knife. She was tall, wearing simple clothes that looked out of place in such an ancient, cursed building, but there was no mistaking her presence. Her eyes were sharp, unwavering, filled with a quiet power that immediately set her apart from the congregation. The visitor snarled. It was a sound of frustration, of disbelief. "No," it hissed, its form writhing in the shadows. "You cannot be here." The woman, Vivian, I realized, didn't flinch. She walked toward the altar with purpose, her steps steady, her gaze locked onto the creature. "I am here to finish this," she said calmly, her voice cutting through the air like a blade. "You've overstayed your welcome." The visitor recoiled as though struck, its form flickering, its presence warping under her gaze. It was as though the very fabric of its existence was being unraveled. Vivian stopped in front of the central tile, her eyes never leaving the visitor's face. She raised her hand slowly, and with a quiet, deliberate movement, she drew something from her coat. A stone, black and smooth, much like the one that had appeared in my hand just days before. But this stone was different. It was pulsing with an energy I could feel even from across the room. With a single motion, Vivian threw the stone at the glowing tile. The unraveling. The world exploded. The tile crackled with a light so bright it blinded me. The air around us felt like it was bending, as though the entire reality of the church was collapsing in on itself. The visitor let out a scream, a horrible, guttural scream that echoed in my mind, twisting my thoughts. But it didn't stop there. The walls began to shatter. The stained glass windows exploded outward, shards of glass flying through the air like knives. The church, once so grand, began to decay. The stone cracked and crumbled, the once pristine floor splitting open, revealing a black void beneath. The visitor's form screamed again, but this time it wasn't a sound of anger. It was a sound of fear. The aftermath. The church fell silent. The oppressive weight that had settled over me lifted, and I found myself breathing again, my body finally able to move. The shadows around me receded, and the dark liquid that had once poured across the floor began to evaporate, dissipating like smoke in the air. I could feel the air grow warmer. The oppressive chill that had settled in my bones was finally gone. But even as the darkness receded, I knew the truth. This was not the end. The church, the visitor, the ritual, they were all connected. And even though the immediate threat was gone, I knew there was something deeper, something far more dangerous waiting. I couldn't let my guard down. Not now. I turned to Vivian, who had been standing silently in the background, watching as the church crumbled before me. Her face was stoic, but there was a glimmer of relief in her eyes. "It's over," I said, my voice hoarse. "Isn't it?" Vivian didn't answer immediately. Instead, she stepped forward, her gaze scanning the ruins of the church. "It's never truly over," she said softly. "The darkness will always find its way back. But you've broken the cycle. For now." I didn't understand. What did she mean? She turned to me, her face still hard, her eyes filled with a kind of knowing I couldn't comprehend. "You were part of it, Tyler. Part of the reason it's here. And part of the reason it's gone. You'll never be free of it. But you've given yourself a chance to escape." I looked around at the broken church. The shadows were gone, but the feeling of dread lingered like a shadow at the back of my mind. "What now?" I asked, the question feeling like a weight I couldn't shake. Vivian smiled faintly, though it was tinged with sadness. "Now you live." The final confrontation takes place as Ethan uses the stone to banish the visitor and break the cycle of darkness that has gripped Saint Francis of the Hollow. The church crumbles, but the terror isn't truly over. The reader is left with the realization that while Ethan has survived this time, the darkness will always linger, waiting to return. The final confrontation takes place as Ethan uses the stone to banish the visitor and break the cycle of darkness that has gripped Saint Francis of the Hollow. The church crumbles, but the terror isn't truly over. The reader is left with the realization that while Ethan has survived this time, the darkness will always linger, waiting to return.